Welcome to the Deeks.ai podcast, where Wake Forest innovators unpack the real-world magic of artificial intelligence through candid conversations. I'm Michael Ferrari.
I'm Ryan Scholl.
Please join us as we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming work across campus, one fascinating story at a time.
Hey everybody! This week we are continuing our conversation with linguist Jerid Francom. We had such a wealth of information and such a fun time speaking with him that we just figured, hey, let's keep this recording going. And so this is part 2. Your AI isn't a genius. It's more like a parrot in a tuxedo. And Jerid continues the show by deconstructing the linguistic tricks of large language models and reveals why the ghost in the grammar is often just a statistical illusion.
I still have an archive of a ton of these O'Reilly books, all the ones with the little animal faces on them about, whether it's Linux or RSS or Atom or, all the different kinds of technologies that were, and Perl and all the fun stuff that you kind of have to start to work with when you're working with building web pages in the way I was doing. I was working with PHP and starting to interface with databases. So I had to learn about MySQL. And so I started just kind of from the ground up, started learning about it. And I had a blast. I just really, really loved it. And my master's degree, that was where I, had started doing these things. And then when I moved on to a PhD, the program I was in didn't have a PhD. I moved into a linguistics department, met some colleagues, or some peers, now colleagues of mine, that were also interested in, technology and also interested in language, but it also kind of introduced me to a world in which those were already being married. So computational linguistics. So
I've heard of that term.
Yeah. And so it was at that point, I started realizing that there might be sort of a home for this connection. Like I could start to see that my learning of shell and the terminal and starting to work with scripts and doing things could actually do some pretty fun stuff with language that you couldn't usually see or do from just being someone who just like observes, like, oh, here's a sentence or here's this, or, sort of think on your own. I started using, data from language use and started quantifying it and starting to see patterns and using that to analyze things. My trajectory in graduate school actually was partly that and then partly into psycholinguistics. It all sort of kind of came together as I was finishing my PhD and moving here to Wake to take on the assistant professor role or my tenure track position. And then ever since then, I've been working with and continuing to develop, whether working with my colleague, one of my really good colleagues from graduate school or others, to continue to develop and work with ways of looking at and understanding language that comes from quantifying it. So that could initially you introduce corpus linguistics, which is the notion that you get a body of texts, usually text because of the most common thing on the web. It's hard to come, to do all the transcription. It used to be more difficult to do all the transcription of the language that we're most exposed to in everyday life. But we worked, more and more to get from beyond just counting and finding patterns to actually starting to work into machine learning. And I got really excited about the machine learning, building algorithms that then could help not only just give me data to look at, but actually do some chunking of those numbers to make predictions. And then we have sort of a feedback loop where we can say, hey, if there's a pattern here, the algorithm in this configuration should be able to pick up on that pattern. If it picks up on it, it suggests there's a pattern and humans could be picking up on these patterns. Let's test that. So it started to really take speed from that. And so moving into machine learning, really, it was just like, for me, this was like in 2014, maybe 2013, 14, just became just so fascinating to me as a methodology to look at lots of different kinds of things in language. And so my areas in language are not very specialized. My methods are.
So you use the term machine learning.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe the difference between the machine learning that you've used in the past and maybe you're currently using with the new term generative AI?
Yeah. So there's always been a number of branches of of computational linguistics, less and for terms, just so this travels a little bit more outside of the area. Computational linguistics as a term exists. Most people practicing what you would call computational linguistics now is under the field of natural language processing. So NLP.
Can you explain what that is?
And so NLP is the umbrella for doing language, right, computationally in a number of different ways, right? So in my particular research, I was very interested in predictive algorithms, so or even exploratory algorithms. So when I say that, I mean like exploratory data analysis, like clustering, like you want to see if there's even a pattern there. Like, so if you're doing some sort of decision tree or use some sort of principal component analysis, or something that you would like to see if there are consistent trends across something, if you're just exploring, or say you have a much more targeted sort of hypothesis, or then you might move to something that's a little bit more algorithmic, like predictive, something like a simple algorithms such as like naive Bayes or even just logistic regression using as a predictive tool. But that's sort of my space, right? Like understanding and organizing and to some degree predicting through machine algorithms. But there's always been an interest in making human computing interfaces. And that hasn't been my interest. My interest is primarily in understanding language and using technologies such as these that can continue to emerge to understand language itself. But the interest in making the computer systems interact with humans better and better has always existed, all the way back to when computational linguistics basically gets its start in the 60s, right? So not long after Claude Shannon, information theory, Noam Chomsky, there's a whole really a big explosion of real interest around both just the idea of what information is, entropy, and all really interesting topics, and then also the other aspects that Chomsky is sort of picks up on and takes what my formal training kind of was informed by. But excuse me. So the fact that this has existed for a long time means that people have been interested in like summarizing texts, or even rudimentary chatbots. Like one of the earlier ones that I like to talk about or introduce people to is one called Eliza. So there has always been an interest in these things, and I've known of them. But the curious part about that, the trajectory since the 60s, 70s, and through as personal computing and every step along the way, many people expected language to be solved, like to figure it out. Computers would figure it out, right? They're really great at computation. Language is just a code to crack, and we will crack it. And so at every turn, it became such a, here's the next big thing that's going to change the world, that most people working in computational linguistics, I guess, and even, especially those outside that were just sort of your formal linguists or people in language, we're kind of just tired of hearing the over hyping of what was on the horizon every single, year. It was like, we're a year away, we're 2 years away from this. And it just never came to fruition. But people kept working on, whether it's text summarization or topic extraction, or, a number of different tasks, which individually had their own uses. And together, though, they didn't necessarily perform very well to the point that they were helpful, right? So they were interesting, and they were research interesting. Like researchers would get really excited about things that if you showed anybody outside world, they'd be like, well, this has got errors all over it. But you understand how this was working? And people get really excited about it. So on the research side, people were very excited about some of these really small movements. But to the outside world, it was not something to write home about. So we're now moving sort of into a new layer of that, in which I still think the gist is really, really important. It's just that now it's not sifting through web pages or archives you create on your own, which you still may do. It's just a little easier. But in that, and this is the part about, information literacy and just the whole understanding of how to find credible and reliable sources. I mean, the internet created a whole new realm of everyone could publish, right? So the democratization of publishing started to create this problem. It wasn't the books or the journals that held the places where we found credible knowledge. Credible knowledge potentially could be a lot of places. So now you had to learn a new skill, and that previously one didn't have to worry about, right? Like if it's in a book, then it's been peer reviewed, it's been looked at. So you had some sense that there was a people behind you or some credibility already sort of instilled. The web broke that down, right? And so now looking through the web, one had to be critical about what they're looking at. Where does it come from? How does it corroborate with other things that I have, maybe have those longer standing traditions of sort of the credibility that comes with publishing or not. Those walls are still breaking down as open access publishing becomes. So we're constantly, I think it's more than just the access to the information, but being able to scrutinize that information. And to the extent that we're scrutinizing what we get, your case, you were talking about actually doing electricity. Your ability to scrutinize that is physical. Does it work or does it not work?
You find that out real quickly.
And you do. Yeah, exactly. And I found myself doing the same thing for tasks, say in my home, right, where I'll take a picture of something and say, hey, something that might have taken me a long time to try to find a forum on an auto part that like I'm not, and then I was like sifting, and there's like these crazy forums and nerds, but they're not my model, or they're not talking about this part, but it's a lot of work, right, to do. And guess what? I don't want to be an expert in that area, but I want that done, right? And the validity of that working or not working is all I need to know in that level. But I wouldn't call that learning. I would call that just problem solving for a very targeted solution. And I do that all the time. I mean, I do that all the time. People talk about, that fun trend of just taking a picture of your refrigerator and saying, hey, what do I got? And coming with the recipe. That's an excellent example of what we can talk about when we talk about generative AI and how functional it is in some ways. We get to education, we're not looking at just like producing some output, right? We're developing, as the teaching and learning community would say, habits of mind. We're developing ways to continue to build on those things that we know and expand and continue to learn and create a spirit of continual learning. And if the learning process to some becomes my learning, quote unquote learning, is going to a generative AI, asking a question, giving an answer, and filling in the blank because it solves my course problem, which is I have a task assigned to me, I get a grade, and it's seen as if I'm just connecting a dot and then I move on. That's definitely subverting learning, because that's where that had worked in the past, like, oh, I give you a task and you do it, then as you knew at least previously as an instructor, they're going to have to struggle through that, and they learn more than what they just produce.
So how do we get that message out to the campus community, to staff, faculty, students? How do we get that knowledge that's in your head and everything you just said? How do we educate? How do we, we're an educational institution. How do we get that knowledge to our staff, our faculty?
Yeah, because just like what you were talking about, like that broad, like generalization, that blanket term of AI, virtually all the people I've talked about who like suffer from that, for lack of a better word, were the most apprehensive and everything. So I think exactly like what you touched on and what Ryan was just asking, that the educating that is a huge thing that needs to be done.
Right. I mean, so how to let me, Michael, let me jump into yours a little bit more and then come back to the how you educate. But like, there's other scary things. I mean, we live in a world that's outside. Education's one, our educational bubble here, but there's the other outside world bit. I think we should be concerned about this issue too. But privacy is a very important component of understanding these technologies, right? I say these technologies because I don't even just mean, AI specifically, but, the internet. I've, in my own thought process and thinking back, I'm a person who's very much passionate about the fact that I think that our the early onset of the internet, not knowing where the internet was going in the first place, was one part of it. But then even by the time we kind of understood the internet was really fundamental, people haven't stopped and made it a priority to say people should understand how the internet works better so that they can be more aware and make informed choices about how they participate in the web or they don't. We dropped the ball on data literacy. And that was something I think we still haven't recovered from. Most people are very unaware about what their activities on the web translate into, how many things are tracking them or not, and if you say that things are tracking you or that you know they're leaving this or connecting that, I think people have become complacent that, well, it's already happening, so you know kind of throw your hands up. I know I'm taking a hiatus, but the web is a very good example for what I think is going on now, in that we now are working not only with a data literacy problem, but we're working with this new AI literacy problem in which we also run the risk of dropping the ball. And by dropping that ball in this case, where the stakes are much, much higher in terms of the lack of understanding leads to either being complacent and going along, or it makes you want to withdraw completely. Right. And in an educational institution, I think that's a responsibility. So this goes back to how do we get people educated? Because I think in the end of the day, you can't do this for the world. You have to start in your backyard. And as a higher education institution, going back to this COVID moment, I just don't think that we can think about a future in which people just go to work and plug into the main, AI at their job without being able to be agents and understanding. Right. So with that in mind, how do you get this message out? I mean, how do you communicate this to people? It's tricky, right? Like I think the COVID moment was one of those kind of tricky moments. I know we felt like there was a time pressure on this thing, right? Like we had an external deadline. We had to say fall, we have to be ready, and there was money, right? So the university saw this as a priority because we definitely want to be one of those campuses that are going to be doing this the best, right? Again, informed choice. Faculty should be able to obviously choose to not do, but it should come from a point of understanding and not from ignorance. And to me, and I don't mean to call anyone ignorant, but just because if it's easy to not be informed. So if you're not actively trying to research this stuff, and it's really hard to not be, it's really easy to be uninformed. And by being uninformed, you end up making choices that come from sources that are probably less, they don't give you a whole lot of agency. You feel more like you're being pushed and pulled by the world around you. And that's not where I think any of us want to be. We want to feel like we're making choices that we can feel like we have a principle why we want to be involved or we don't want to be involved. At the moment, I think faculty, students, around everyone, I think for the most part, are feeling like you either just have to adopt it because it's inevitable, or you have to resist it because you're not going to be one of those people who just accepts things. And then that kind of just creates this separation.
So let's give your brain a break, maybe.
Yeah, hit me.
We're gonna take a left turn.
Yes,
we're gonna move from.
We need a left turn.
we're gonna move from theoretical, to more concrete. You are doing a pilot with the Writing Center and developing an AI tool. I think your goal is actually to create better human connections, but can you explain a little bit about what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so already dabbling in lots of techie things and stuff, and AI is obviously first came to us sort of as some sort of miracle that only only magicians could understand and do. Quickly the amazing open source community started creating and it's continued to evolve into a very robust community. And so this I say free and open source software, right? So the FOSS. And that's existed forever. I mean, Linux is a product of that, and now all of the servers in the university are running on Linux, and many companies do, and there's all sorts of things. It's not just little hobby. I mean, people spend their time voluntarily to do these things, but it's solid stuff, right? What's awesome about it is that in my case, I'm interested in saying, hey, why don't we step away from like these one-stop shop? Maybe Google does everything, and let's see if we can put some agency back in the hands of educators, and let's test or pilot and address some of the issues that I see potentially problematic with introducing AIs into things that have to do with our students, our classes, our workflows. And in the process, try to educate, speaking of the education, and also address a number of issues that are surrounding the way we think about, again, the big AI topic. And the idea is to put small language models. So these are still very big in history, but like compared to the trillion, parameter models that, the big guys are running, right? The smaller models are like, you can get 10 billion parameters models. And then you can, fine tune them, training them on a certain set of sort of interactive pairs, and it can learn from analogy those kind of pairs, add some domain specific knowledge to those pairs, and start to put them to use in subdomains. So they're not going to answer history questions or math problems, but a specific kind of issue. And as I was thinking about doing some sort of like tutoring, so how do we do this for tutoring? I started realizing a sort of a general tutor is kind of a big thing. There's actually more to it. As I started shopping around to different faculty, and I ran into ended up talking to Ryan Shirey at the Writing Center, and we had a great conversation, and love his viewpoints and his thought process, and it kind of came out during that conversation in their process of putting students, getting students signed up and coming to a tutoring session. They sort of have a sort of a in process, right? So students will, name and what time you want in. They'll ask them, well, what do you need help with, right? So there's this box that they give them to say what they need help with. Of course, this would be helpful for the tutor downstream to understand like what they're getting prepared for, orient them to what's going on. But it came out that too few people write about that, and most people don't really have an idea what their problem is, or what they're trying to address at least. And it kind of occurred to him and I, and we were thinking about it, it's like, you know what, this might be an opportunity to do this kind of focus thing. So where a student comes in and they're filling out this thing and say, hey, what are you looking to help, or what do you feel like your issue is? And if they don't know, they can jump into a specific, tool, chatbot basically, that is designed specifically to just bring that student, bring up awareness that will both serve the tutor to understand where that student's at, but also bring a metacognitive process into that student to understanding where they're at. Like they might not know, but if they're asked a series of the right questions, like, oh, hey, what's this for? Oh, it's for a history class. Have you written a draft already? Yes, I have. What do you feel about your draft? Oh, then you might need with it. And so it brings the student hopefully to a point where they kind of better understand what their problem is. That information can then be, part of that session. So a tutor is then saying, this is what this student thinks their problem is. And both arrive to that session closer than they were when they would otherwise show up, which is, okay, I'm going to ask you what you're doing. What class is it for? And how much time does that take to get to that point where now tutor gets to apply their knowledge and help, right?
It makes that human to human session much more valuable.
That's the idea. And in that we would, you don't need the sledgehammer of a Gemini. The pilot is, or at least the idea, the notion is we can use a very small model trained on the right specific task that would run very efficiently. So it's not going to be, running like these crazy, power hungry models, private, completely inside of our institution. The development of those sorts of the fine tuning that goes on, and the development of the materials that would go in to be the knowledge base for that, the writing center and stakeholders involved in that get a process. It helps them define their missions and their understandings of what they want. So they go through a process of education for their own sake, but also understand how they can shape a tool that benefits them, and that they can do that, right? And so the idea I would really like to see is to see people understand that these aren't some sort of Midas touch, bing, you have to have millions of dollars to do this. This is something that we can get off the shelf. No one has to pay for it. Of course, the power to run the electricity and whatnot. But otherwise, we can empower people to both educate them about these things, create tools that work in their service, for their service, that they can change themselves, and that help in a way that brings what they want together in a way that they want, right? The agency
Mhm.
is one of the key parts to that. But I believe it's also addressing privacy and the ecology, you know, the sustainability aspects of this, you know, all of the spirit of what I think these technologies can be to more people. And also, you know, like I said, going through the educational, that's an educational process. That's a hands-on, I understand. You walk away from that and you say, well, it wasn't as effective, or we could tweak it, or maybe whatever comes of it, everybody surrounding that will be better off going forward. And to see those things spring up and think about, hey, you know what, my group or this, you know, might benefit from that. Or, hey, you know what, you know, I always have a problem when I have, as a faculty member, right? I have people sign up for my office hours. You know, it'd be really cool if I could help them get the process rolling. So when they came in, I know exactly what I know what to prepare when we're going to get there. I can, but because again, I mean, faculty hours are the same. We end up going, so what are we working with? Well, I have a little bit of help because they're my students, so we kind of know where we're at. But like this exact kind of model could just be tweaked again and again and again and again. There's other applications that we can imagine happening. So I'm interested in developing and exploring this idea of what we call ed AI, right? So, or a larger umbrella that I'm just developing this out myself, like AI praxis. So thinking about ways of making it available and educating people to be able to become agents in this space instead of just consumers in this space.
So there are two terms that you mentioned that I want you, one of them I want you to expand on. You mentioned small language models
Mhm.
and open models. I think we're going to do a separate episode on small language models, so we'll leave that one alone for a second.
Okay.
Those purpose-built small models. I know you are very big into open source models for a variety of reasons. Can you explain a little bit about what they are? Now, we've actually done a whole episode on them, but for the people who haven't gone back and listened to our episode, maybe explain a little bit about what they are and why they are so important and why a company would build them.
An open source model usually just call it open weights. And when we talk about weights, we're talking about all of the nuts and bolts that link all of the probabilities that have all of the generative powers, right? So when, you know, and fundamentally a generative,
It makes Anthropic very different from Grok, XAI, because those weights are tweaked differently.
yeah, and the weights can be tweaked because of a myriad of reasons, right? But the end product is a model, right? And a model, like a model is a microcosm of what it was exposed to. I mean, that's fundamental part about what models are, right? They're not a perfect representation of what they were exposed to previously. So you have lots of data, and then how you expose it to the data, right? So that's the whole thing about tokens, and you chunk them up, and then how the architecture is built such that it relates those different little chunks is also a huge part of it. The inference part will leave behind because that's another chunk. That's when it actually does something with all of those weights. But the open weights, you know, people will make those available and have done for a very long time. A very common website to go to peruse any of these, which will probably give people give them headaches to look at, is Hugging Face. Hugging Face has been as a machine learning and a paradise. It's full of data sets, and I mean data sets are just of really interesting kind of stuff.
Somebody will release these models
Yeah.
to the world and basically publish, hey, this is what we did. This is how we use it.
Exactly.
And then you could go and download that model for yourself.
Correct. Yeah. And if anybody wants to get started really easy, there's a project called Olama. And Olama itself is not a model, but it's a piece of software that they have both a graphical interface, so you can download and work on it like you would with most software that people are used to, or the sort of terminal-based sort of black and white screen stuff that I'm used to. But Olama, you can download a series of different kinds of models, and depending on the machine that you're working on, you can definitely run these on your own laptop, right? There's some constraints on those things, but like you if you poke around, there's lots of tutorials like, you have a machine with this much RAM or this much VRAM or whatever else, things that might already sound crazy, but knowing that is very helpful. But you could run a model on your laptop, and you download Olama and you can start playing with it and say, whoa, look, that's not even connected to the internet. Or, oh, like I can, download a model that's been trained to use tools, and one of those tools is the internet, and then it can, there these things. So anyway, inherently there's these open weights, and these open weights are then, it can be manipulated under certain different conditions. So OpenAI has a series of open weights. Gemini has theirs called Gemma. Anthropic has never released anything open. Llama, which is not to be, there's a lot of llamas in this space, but Llama being from Meta. And then there's a whole series of the Chinese companies who have done
They're killing it with the open models.
Yes, they're all over the place. Now the ones that compete with the frontier models in the United States and the big companies that we talk about, the models are so large, and the actual ability to run those would be impossible for most people. I mean, our cluster Edit could do it, right? But it's not the thing that you run on your computer.
So why would these companies give this stuff away for free?
You know what? That's a good question. From a point of view of like, are they just in it for the money? But there's a interesting component of tweaking and playing with it. So I think with a lot of technologies in this sort of active open source space, people are just interested in getting people to play and experiment and play. So when you get an open weight model, it's not just like, okay, that's the end of the story, right? Like, there's lots of other tools that you can then manipulate and tweak and change, and then people re-release those on Llama. So the big ones you'll see first are the ones that are sort of like, oh, these are pre-prepared for you just to run. But then if you either in the llama.com site or you go to Hugging Face, you're going to find people that have tweaked those models, those base models or those foundation models, that they've changed them in ways that do this or that or the other at better or worse ways. And you can just explore to your heart's content. And it inspires a sort of innovation. And to some degree, I'm sure that there's some interesting sort of like, interesting, look, they get this model, do this. We could learn from that to some degree. But it also just gets their name out there. I mean, I definitely hear a lot more roll about DeepSeek, or right now Kimi is like huge. People are freaking out on the Kimi 2, and these are names that, as they start to percolate through this, the more underground computing interested people, the more they percolate up into everyday vocabulary, and next thing you know, like their website, which charges for their models, is now relevant where they might not have been relevant if they had just put up their webpage. So
I think there are three big reasons. One is the branding, like you're talking about. Two, builds a community around the product. But the third is innovation, and I think you touched on that as well. That these companies put it out there, let other people do innovation for them, and then bake that in to some of their other models. They can see what people want to do with them. Yeah. Given all that, why are these models so important for researchers and for universities?
Yeah, again, I think that that spirit of innovation is really what makes anything worth. Yeah, no, I think there's a theme that I'm keeping. It's kind of becoming a bit like the agency component. Yeah, and the innovation of spirit and creativity, this ability to be involved. Maybe that's how we are. I mean, how people, we get older and they just they become, just fall out of the loop, and everything seems crazy around their world, and they have their grandkids help them do something because they just stopped being involved. Maybe that's a natural progression of people. But I also find younger people that are younger faculty that are also kind of very on this thing too. So, I don't know how much that is just a function of I doubt it's as much as a function of you're just from an older generation than younger people, and somewhat of just concern that somehow doesn't have a home or a source to come from. It just doesn't sound right. You're getting spidey tingles, like this doesn't sound, I don't know about this, man. And one thing we didn't touch about was an intelligence. And I don't know if this is relevant because it seems like a tangent, but to me it's an important thing. We were talking about intelligence. I think we did talk about Eliza, but we didn't talk about how much Eliza convinced people back in the day that it was actually intelligent. And I think that is something I'm interested in, but it doesn't have to go here at all. But like people were convinced that people were told later that this was a bot and this was all just a simple algorithm, and people were like, no, it's intelligent. Like here's like when people see some demonstration of something that looks human, we are just not faced in nature.
Those people were crazy, right?
Yeah, those people must have been crazy.
Okay, so do you think the current iteration of these generative artificial intelligent models are intelligent?
No, they're not.
Do you think they have consciousness?
No.
Why?
So the underlying understanding of modeling a world based on the juxtaposition of words in a corpus in a way that satisfies and is useful to a human can give a human the impression of intelligence. Well, it is intelligent, right? But a sense of a deeper type of intelligence that we might call a consciousness, simply because my assumption is it's not something we've ever faced in nature. Like we never, our species has never interacted with another being or another form of intelligence that performs like we perform without that assumption that they are also conscious. We only experience our own consciousness, right?
So if we've never encountered that, how are you saying it's not intelligent?
Well, so intelligence, it is, right? So intelligence is different. So I think this is an important distinction.
You think it's intelligent, just not conscious?
There's lots of intelligences, right? I mean, very, very simple organisms are intelligent, right? Like they have goals and they get them done, and so there's an intelligence involved in that. And when we talk, when people again, this is one of those things where it takes, and I'm not claiming to be an expert in this area, but it definitely takes a little bit of unpacking from when we talk about intelligence generally out in the world, and when we talk about intelligence, when we actually start to define what intelligence is, we find that intelligence is found in very, 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 very simple forms, and is intelligence none the same. So, is this an intelligence? Yes, it's clearly intelligence. The aspect that scares people, I think, is the sense of what we would attribute to a conscious being, right? And so something that's conscious has some self-awareness, or I mean, there's a deeper philosophical consciousness is also hard to define, right? But when we see the kind of intelligence that we are seeing in the helpful AI, there is a instant connectivity to a consciousness. Like there's nothing that we've ever been exposed to that performs as AI does and interacts with us as it does, that doesn't also have consciousness, right? And I think we attribute those things. We lend it those things. It's not. It's more of assumption. So I guess I start off with a strong sense that it's not conscious. Like I can prove that it's not conscious. I think that's probably the wrong way to take it. It's more that we definitely are very prone to assuming consciousness in this case with the level of intelligence that we are seeing, and to remind ourselves that the juxtaposition of fragmented language constructed through probabilistic systems and then displayed to us in a way that is useful does not constitute consciousness, right? Like that it in itself does not. But any human or anything that we've ever been exposed to that does what AI is doing, in our experience as a species, has always been conscious. So to think that somehow it's conscious because it does this, performs this, is just to assume that must be the case. And that's just an assumption. It's important that I think that's important. To establish that it isn't conscious is deeper. I think my intuition about this is that it's just not, right? People go, well, look, it said it's intelligent. I mean, you ask it a question and it says, are you conscious? Yes, I am. Or no, I'm not. It's been programmed that yes or no. Initially, they didn't have all these little guardrails, right? That wouldn't give you these. First, you would say, what do you think? It was, I can't think. And you remember? And then they said, well, we got to make it sound more natural. So it has to take a first person perspective on things. I mean, these are all model tweaks that you do to make the human experience better. And part of that human experience being better, there's surely some side products that also produce language, meta language that provides us evidence. But like, it's not about that. That what it tells you isn't evidence to consciousness, right? Yeah, like I mentioned before, Eliza early on, very basic, super simple algorithm, and it was, people had to be convinced it wasn't human too, and it was the most basic thing you can imagine. I mean, it had none of the sophistication here, but it did form sentences. It did. But it performed as a Rogerian sort of like psychologist. So, and you say, I feel like this. It's like, why do you feel like that? And, you know, back and forth. And people felt helped. You know, it was sort of a psychologist. I mean, what would a psychologist do? A typical one of the day, you know, just ask you why you feel it. And you would fill in all the gaps. And by doing that, you felt like you were served. And how could a machine do that? Right? It wasn't. You know, it was just facilitating your own. You filled in the gaps for it. So we're very much in that same experience in a lot of ways. Our abilities to predict, this is a very interesting aspect about, you see people all the time, this model's better than that one. No, that one's worse than this one. No, there's people freaking out all the time. There's a simple principle why people all have these different experiences with the output of these models. I mean, the obvious ones is you're asking it this way or you're asking it that way. And there's obviously, we talked about this prompting stuff, right? Clearly setting up context and whatnot is helpful. It's becoming something that they're dealing with on the engineering side to make it less and less necessary, with memory and blah, 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 whatnot. But at the end of the day, what we also make an abundant, a huge leap of assumptions about what is hard and what is not. So for what a human thinks is easy, or what a human thinks is hard, right? We have sort of like an assumption curve. Like I say, oh, multiply blah, blah, blah by this and da, 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 da. Is that hard? Yeah, it's hard, right? Or something much more hard than that, right? Obviously, we know computers do much better than that. A calculator shows us that. That's hard for us. Calculator can do it and no big deal, right? So that's not really a good example. But there's lots of examples in which we think something's simple, but we don't know how complex that really is. We just assume it's simple because it's easy to us. And when you actually kind of map out, this is really interesting sort of prediction of what will be hard is nice and smooth from a human. Like, okay, this test, and you got people's assumptions, and you get these nice curves. And then you actually aggregate model answers to those, and they're, you see that there's this jagged thing. So some things that are easy for us are easy for computers, and some things that are easy for us are very hard for computers, and vice versa, right? So our ability to predict what is hard for machines, and in this particular, it's always been an issue, but in these cases as well with AI, it shows us how much this is not. We assume so much about what it can do because it did this. Oh man, it's got to be able to do that. And so again, that's evidence to suggest it's not working like we work. It's not the principles underlying what is doing the mechanisms and thinking, right? Again, it's all very different. It's very interesting. I mean, it's all really very interesting. There's a whole interesting line of research that I'm engaging after initially getting involved in. I mean, right after I decided to send my email to my chair, I started thinking to myself, oh my gosh, how is it processing language? Like, what about some things? I wonder if I could see what it does with things that linguists have been thinking about for a while, and see if I could form some sort of tests to kind of find out. My dissertation happened to be on the what we call unacceptable sentences, particularly a set of sentences called extraction islands, and subset of those are these questions that are for most people uninterpretable. Like you hear it and you go, a human will just go, there's not an answer to that. But structurally, it has an answer. Like you could figure it out if you understand what's going on. But because of the way, whatever mechanism, there's a lot of debate about why humans don't parse it well, whether it's a memory limitation or whether it's a function of our internal grammars of our language or whatnot. There's a lot of interesting evidence, and my dissertation was on actually multiple exposures to these not acceptable sentences and the change over time that sometimes is produced. Like people find answers for different the same structural stuff, but some of them not at all. So like an example one would be say, what did Mary buy the piano and? The guitar. right? But that doesn't
obviously.
I know, but that, I mean, if you structurally, is you bought, a piano and a guitar, and you are just asking about the guitar part, not the piano part, you can see, if you can backtrack it, that it's a question you could form, but it sounds like word salad, right? There's a slew of other ones, right? So I decided I'd take a slew of these little dudes and say, hey, I'm going to give you a set of sentences here, and I'd like you to give me plausible answers to these, right? And plunk, answered very plausible answers to all of them. The human doesn't do that. The human would be stumped with each and every one of them, right? Equally. I mean, not equally. Some of them more so than others. But nonetheless, it was just like clear that whatever limitations that humans are undergoing with this particular kind of, issue that we have with our own language and these kinds of structures, this model is not limited by that. So that was interesting. Structurally, the internal grammar, if there ever is one, that's a question. Is there even a grammar involved? Because all we're doing is juxtaposing a bunch of sequences of tokens, right? There's nothing that says this is a phrase and this is a this. And the sort of stuff that linguists posit exists because of our experience with studying language for so long. So that was one interesting little anecdote. That was like really early on. And then the second batch, I thought, well, let me get a whole different domain. Let's think about some really interesting things that have to do with the influence of metaphor on the way we think about things, right? So metaphor we're often we encounter this without recognizing it as much as we probably should, like say in news headlines. Depending on the frame, we can frame things in sort of metaphoric ways, and that the metaphors that we frame, there's a really interesting study that had to do with like where if it's possible to induce different responses to address this issue that was posed depending on the metaphor you used, and then where you introduced the metaphor, did that matter, like how people would respond. So the example, the basic example they had was this: crime is and then whatever you were going to metaphorically frame it as. So one set of participants got, crime is a virus. And then it goes on to give all these information about this little town that has all these problems with crime, right? Okay, so all of the information is exactly the same. They're asked to provide solutions to this problem, like brainstorm, what would you do? And then the other set of people get, crime is a beast. And then all the data is the same. Exactly the same as the other group. The only difference is that one saw crime as a virus and one saw crime as a beast. And interestingly, it influences the way humans tend to respond in terms of the way they pose solutions. So if you frame it as a beast, we think about beast. That affects the way we think about the solutions and a virus, etc. Right? So I thought, hey, everyone's talking about bias. I've doing corpus linguistics for a long time. We know that the probabilities of certain kinds of relationships they abound. That's not surprising, right? So like, like nurse and female, or doctor and male. Those associations are super widely known, right? And like, the issues of trying to use corpus linguistics in court cases, because all the previous court cases, of course, can go all the way back to times when people were using race as a very, very big determinant on how they're going to sentence people, inherent with all kinds of bias. That's what people talk about when they think about bias in AI still, but that's kind of like, for myself, that's like, yeah, that's a thing. That's been a thing. What do you expect? The data is distributing as much as you expect to say something about statistics and get statistics information back. That's expected, right? They're related in discourse, right? At least. The interesting thing is that I pulled up a couple different chat sessions, different ones, so they wouldn't be contaminating each other. And I had posed that question that they did in the research. Now, I didn't go through all of the different scenarios of where the metaphor gets inserted, because the evidence found strongly the biggest effect was at the beginning. So for reasons that we won't go into, but necessarily, it was interesting that when I put those in, the chatbot gave me back a slew of both perspectives, right? It did not get biased with the beast or the virus. It kind of gave you the same set, both the kinds that people tend to produce when framed as a beast and as a virus in both things. So people talk a lot about the bias that that is the kind of like, oh, associations between groups or people or things. But there's another kind of bias. It does not follow our biases in other ways that are kind of interesting. So there's a whole interesting, and I sort of just interestingly picked up on this right at the beginning and kind of left it to the side. And only just recently I was talking to a colleague in computer science, Fan Yang. He brought it to me because he had seen a paper that had just come out in a recent conference from the ACL, so one of the big computational linguistics or NLP conferences. They got first prize, and it was a number of linguists who were interested in understanding more about how we can think about large language models to test questions about what is representation in the human brain. Like, so how do we represent language in the human brain by using things that we have a little bit better control, understanding what the inputs and outputs are, right? Like, we're a black box, so are AI models to a large extent, right? These deep learning models are it's difficult, but there are inroads we can make there. And so I've just been recently kind of getting more involved as he's kind of awoken again, like this question, like, hey, like, what do we think when we think about like what is actually being formed? How does a machine coming to, what is it understanding? Not what is understanding, sorry. How is it representing things? And how does that representation look or not look like human representation from what we understand? And so there's an interesting kind of neat little way to kind of start backtracking, thinking about the way humans process and think about language from an angle that uses these models as sort of test beds for playing with how grammars can manifest, whether they likely it's the case that there could be numerous ways, I mean, maybe unlimited number of ways that you can converge on a grammar that looks like human grammar. What's curious, though, is that they don't reject sentences. So humans, you and I, say, like I gave you that question, you were like, if I were to ask you, is that a sentence of English, you would say no, right? Chatbot, well,
yeah.
So people are often not thinking about the negative evidence because they're not trained to be that way, right? They're trained to be helpful. And people train. You don't put in a chatbot. You don't write word salad to a chatbot, right? So there's nothing in its training. It's not trained to behave like a human behaves with language. It's trained to be helpful. And so being helpful, we aren't pushing it to do things, but we could push it to not do these things. How does that affect the whole system? There's a lot of interesting investigation going on. Again, going back to some of the things that we were talking about before in terms of the spirit of being able to work with these models. We can only do that kind of research when we have access to open weight models. We can only do that. We cannot spend the money to train the absolute. To train these models is a lot of money, even the open source ones. This is serious. But we can mess with those models, right? We can train them it's a layer training, whether it's superficial fine tuning or more deep fine tuning. Regardless, we can play with these things, and having that as an ability to get into those and to experiment with those has obviously got a lot of potential and a lot of appreciated sort of potential for research that isn't necessarily about we'll get an answer like we expect from a chatbot, but like just understanding things about humans, who are we, how we work, and things like that. So there's lots of obvious reasons why we should be interested in getting beyond just thinking about AI as this like Geminis and the other things. And the other part is just the fact that I think we can use them as tools in other really creative ways to fit into our workflows, to experiment, to learn, and to be informed about how the future could be, not just how a few people decide it should be. And again, that's my ethos in this.
Thanks again to our guest, and thanks for listening to the Deeks.ai podcast. Please continue to follow the AI discussion by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. If you have any comments, questions, or would like to join the discussion, please email us at deeks.ai@wfu.edu.